Well, good day and welcome to the Financial Services Club. We're having a webinar today with Iain Clacher entitled All Too Inhuman, Artificial Intelligence and Applications in Retirement Savings. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm chairman of the Zien Group, and I'm really delighted today to welcome Iain. Iain has done some work with us over the years on pensions, but what most people forget is he's got an extremely good technical background, which you will have already read in the invitation email. Iain is going to cover quite a bit of ground today, and much of what he says is of relevance to our sponsors who provide systems and equipment in the space or services such as pensions planning. But more importantly, Iain's talk today is of importance to all of us personally. Coronavirus permitting, we hope to draw our pensions down, and I think it's important that we have a good idea of what AI can and can't do in this space. The format today is that once I get out of your way, Iain is going to get to the heart of the matter and give us a presentation of approximately 25 minutes. We will then have time for questions, which I will field to Iain from you. So please access the question box and feel free to type questions in. I may, as you suspect, at times consolidate similar questions, and I will certainly ignore things like the chairman of this event is not doing a very good job. So anyway, looking forward to all of you having a good and entertaining time. And Iain, I think at this point, I'd like to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody for joining. I'm really looking forward to this, although it's a slightly odd experience. So I've been about pensions in various ways for quite a long time, and as Michael said, I've done bits and pieces with Zien in the long finance on different aspects, including things like blockchain applications and CDC, which was a lot of fun. And this isn't really like my academic work. This is something that I've been thinking about and putting together for a long time. So this is the condensed version of about an hour long presentation, and it has two different aspects to it. One is a sort of overview of what artificial intelligence is and how I see artificial intelligence maybe working in, say, the pension space. And that's quite important because there's a lot of vagueness, I think, about how people think about it. And so being precise about the aspects of artificial intelligence that you think are valuable and the challenges is quite important. The second bit is then to go on to pensions as they are today, and then potentially where I see some of the upsides, some of the real innovation that could take place, and also the sort of barriers and the challenges around that. The other problem, I suppose, with doing it remotely is I usually like to do quite light-hearted pensions things and presentations in general, and sometimes I can even be funny, but it's very difficult to gauge your audience in a situation like this. So I'm going to persist with the few jokes that I can keep in here, and hopefully they're entertaining, but if they're not, I'll never know. So I suppose the first thing is this idea of what it is, artificial intelligence, because over the past, I would say 5 years, maybe just a little bit longer, we've seen everybody move from being a business doing X to being a data-driven business, and everybody from financial services out really starting to focus on their data. And I've had odd conversations with organisations that you would never consider to be a data business per se, and that's how they now view themselves. And there's obviously a gap between data science and artificial intelligence and people who are expert in that area, and potentially this what a CEO thinks could be achieved in an SME somewhere outside of financial services, for example, or IT for that matter. And so there's a bit of a gap. So I quite like this slide because it starts to put bounds around what we're talking about. So all technologies that enable computers to mimic human intelligence is artificial intelligence. And that term's been about since the 50s. And my favourite experiment for this is called ELIZA. And in the experiment for ELIZA, I think it was a psychiatrist or a psychologist that put this together. And what they did is they programmed a computer, and you then interfaced with the computer. So the computer would start out and it would ask you, "How are you today, Ian?" And I would say, "Well, Eliza, I'm a bit sad." And they would say, "Well, why are you sad, Ian?" And I would say, "Well, I don't feel my boss appreciates me." And then the computer would ask me, "Well, why doesn't your boss appreciate me?" And over the course of this conversation, I personally start to think there is an empathetic system there that's trying to understand me and help me. And actually, it's the con artist trick. The computer mimicked back the questions. There was no intelligence to it. So I say I'm sad, it says, "Why are you sad?" and so on and so forth. So that's not what we're talking about. Then we've got machine learning, and this is where we can get a computer to improve by potentially adding more data to an algorithm, or to improve and refine that algorithm. And there's potentially some aspect of that machine learning in where you've got experiential learning that can be then adapted through time. There's an aspect of that I think that's probably relevant to pensions, but where all the activity is, where all the action is now, is in deep learning and deep neural networks. And there's been two trends that have actually really enabled this. One is Google, Facebook, and so on, and the ubiquity of data, but also actually computer gaming. So the processing power that we see to drive an awful lot of the computer games that are out there now have led to this ability to actually now really see some of the promise that was there in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, but died away because the ideas that were good, the ideas that were valuable, couldn't actually be worked on and actioned because we didn't have the volume of data and we didn't have the computer processing power. So when we look at machine learning, we've got two different categories. We've got supervised learning, and that's where we have a predictive model, and it's based on input data. We tell the computer, and we can use things like regression, statistics, and so on to then actually learn and have some sort of process where the computer can do predictive analysis and classification. And then we've got unsupervised learning, and this is where we group and interpret data and things are clustered. And there's an important distinction between the two. So if we have supervised learning, then this illustration is something I took off Google Images. I might put some sort of link on this, Michael, for another point in time for the source. But basically, we go through and we tell the computer, this is a duck, this is a duck, this is not a duck, this is not a duck. And we then see how the computer performs. And through that supervised learning process, we can see there's a predictive model, and we can see how well the classification and the prediction works. If we get a good model, then we're going to be able to separate the ducks out from the things that are not the ducks. And if it's bad, we can go back and we can work on the data potentially, or we can work on the algorithms and the modeling to get a better outcome. Where we have deep learning, what we're looking at is a deep neural network learns hierarchical features from different representations. So one of the places where this has been applied very widely and to really quite incredible success now is in computer vision. And what we have is we have an input layer, and the computer starts to train itself and learn on that, and we have an output layer, and it starts to classify. And so one of the early hopes was, in terms of thinking about how computers could process, the most efficient processing unit we have, or at least we know about, is the human brain. And so as you look at all these layers and all these networks, then as you go to a deep neural network and you have multiple layers, you start to see something for me that looks a bit like a human brain, where we've got connections between synapses and so on. And that was the principle around which this was originally thought about and conceptualized and developed. So what we then have is we've got all our different characters, Disney characters, and we have some sort of unsupervised learning process. And then the output is the computer has correctly clustered the ducks together, Mickey Mouse is separate, and Bugs Bunny, who's not a Disney character, but anyway, is a separate category as well. So this is clearly worked. We've got everybody separated out, but it's unsupervised. So what we don't know is how the computer has done this, essentially. That becomes really important in financial services, because we have to be able to explain our decisions. So where we have this level of complexity, these deep neural networks, it's something of a black box. Now, there are there's actually a very good paper from the Bank of England that's looking at Shapley regressions, I think, and how these things can start to be unpacked. But this is one of the big challenges in financial services, because we have to be able to justify what we've done. So if we think about something like credit rationing, I have to be able to say the reason this person didn't get a loan is X, and the reason this person got it is Y. And there are cases where sort of computer systems have been used, there have been black boxes, and there's been bias in the system, and we can't have biased systems. So it's a big challenge in general, but also one I think is very relevant for financial services. So that first example of ELIZA is one where the computer's not reasoning and it's not learning, it's just repeating. So it's not intelligent in a way in which we would think of that as an intelligent system, that as an intelligent person. And what we've seen since the 80s is a slow creep, but it's accelerated hugely in the past decade of progress. And so the first real example I think that would have probably hit public consciousness is Deep Blue and Gary Kasparov playing chess, and the computer won. But chess is an interesting game, but it's quite limited in terms of the combinations and the probabilities, and so it's quite easy now, at least, it was a challenge then, but now to develop a computer. And actually I've got one in my mobile phone because I like playing chess, but I'm very bad at it. So it's nice to get beaten private rather than in public. But it's a grandmaster. It could probably beat Magnus Carlsen or whoever else, or at least it would give them a very good run for their money. So that's a really interesting challenge, but where we're getting to now is new strategies. So there is Google's DeepMind. DeepMind was established in the UK. Google bought it, but DeepMind is essentially independent of Google. And really interesting company, really innovative, and they do really cool stuff. So one of the things that they did was an old game called DQN Breakout. And that's where you've got a block of a wall, you've got a paddle at the bottom and a little ball which goes up, hits the wall, and a brick disappears. And so they trained, they used a deep neural network, and they started to see how a computer would progress. Now, in the full version of this presentation, which I can make available online, there's a video that shows you the progress of the computer. What's interesting about it is they left, I think after 300 or 400 iterations, the computer had hit the level of the best sort of human player at this. They decided to leave the computer on until around 600 iterations of this. And at that point, the computer worked out a completely new strategy. The computer worked out that if you tunnel down one side of the wall and you put the ball up the back, it can then bounce around. And so actually, the computer developed a completely new strategy, and it did it in about 4 or 5 hours, I think, from memory, which is remarkable. So we then go to the next thing, which is AlphaGo. Now, goes probably as old as chess, if not a bit older, very, very popular in Southeast Asia, South Korea in particular. And Go is much, much, much harder than chess. I've tried Go, can't do it, I'm sticking to chess. If you think about chess, chess has got 20 opening moves, Go's got 361. So the complexity that we're seeing in that challenge as a game of strategy is much, much greater. And there's a wonderful documentary on this on Netflix, and Lee Sedol is the Gary Kasparov, the Magnus Carlsen of the world of Go. And not to spoil the end, but the computer wins. But there's something much more important in all of this, which is called Move 37. And it's worth watching the video, which is watching the documentary, but also just a video on YouTube about this, because you see all the professional Go commentators, because the world was watching this in the same way as Gary Kasparov in the 90s, and the computer makes a move very early on, and everybody thinks it's a mistake, and it's not. That move has been studied, and actually there is a general sense that the computer developed a new strategy, a new way of playing a game which has been about for thousands of years, which is again remarkable. So computers can reason and learn now, which is really quite interesting in the context of many things that we're interested in, including pensions. Oh, we've jumped. That's okay. So we'll know the answer to this question now. So the question is, what about having common sense? So if we take two people, one's born November 1948, the other's born December 1948, they're both from England, both divorced, both worth over $100 million, and they're both a prince. And if you go to the next slide.
Sorry about that.
That's okay, that's the way the joke works. It's funny now in two different ways. Clearly, these are two very, very different princes. One is the future king, and one is Ozzy, the Prince of Darkness. And the point that this is trying to make is the quality of the data, the granularity of the data, the precision of the data is what is going to drive outcomes. So it would be very easy for a computer to say, well, this could be the same person, or these two people are very alike. And so if we're thinking about how we cluster people, how we group them together, then that becomes very important. How do we make sure that we make advice and guidance and use artificial intelligence that is directly tailored to somebody like me versus somebody that's like Michael, because we're very different people and we need very different things from any advice that we get. And if we start to go into a world of robo advice, as you'll see, then this is one of the challenges. So what does innovation in pensions look like today? Well, innovation in pensions, for me, I think is very, very limited. Pensions is difficult in general. I think we've seen innovation in our policy side, say around something like Nest and automatic enrolment. But if you think about systems, the way in which people get data, the way in which they interface and engage with their savings, it's really, really poor. And the industry, for lots of reasons, has failed to deliver genuine innovation. And so if we look at something like the pensions dashboard, that's still trundling on. The fact that that hasn't been delivered yet, I think tells us something about where pensions is. It's quite important. The other one is annual pension statements, a simplified statement. So one of my favourite apps is Moneybox. I found it sometime last year, and I like all the stuff that it does. It's convenient, it's personal, it nudges you, it helps you to make better decisions. So you can just round up everything into a separate account, and it's got all these little bits of innovation that are very low level, but it's really nice and it's easy. Getting an annual statement, which most people still don't understand, but it's better than what they got, that's considered innovation in the pension sector. So I think the industry is ripe for disruption. I think the industry needs to do better for people, and technology is something that could help support that, but I think the challenge is huge. So what does pensions look like tomorrow? Well, I think if you look at a lot of the global trends that we see personalisation. We're talking about things like tailored advertising in television. So the advertising that I see within, or the product placement that I see within a given show will be different to what Michael sees. So if we're looking at that level of granularity, that level of personalisation, then that's clearly something that could be very valuable to the pension sector, because my circumstances, my needs, my wants, my interests, my level of competence is going to be very different from everybody else's. And so if we can think about pensions as a way in which you can create something that is bespoke to Iain, that's going to be really significant in helping people do better in their retirements. And one of the ways in which this could happen is through chatbots. Now, chatbots can be very basic, but they can also be relatively sophisticated. And one of the general trends, now obviously this is slightly dated, but I think the underlying principle will hold longer term, is the market was worth about 860 million in 2017, and it's expected to grow, or was expected to grow when I started to look at this last year, to about $4.1 billion by 2023. And I think some of that's still going to come. And actually, it might accelerate, because one of the things that the current crisis is teaching us is how much we can do remotely. So actually, this might happen faster in some sense. But anyway, what tomorrow looks like is interesting in a long-term situation. If we look at this, what we're seeing is Google searches for chatbots, and we see quite a significant uptick. I think this is in millions. So one thing that's worth pointing out is roughly, I think between January 17 and January 18, I think Facebook put a chatbot on Facebook. I don't use it as a platform. I don't like social media. And so I was led to believe that there was a spike in activity because a lot of people were saying, Google, how do you switch off the Facebook chatbot? But I've only heard that anecdotally. So some of that uptick might be that. But what we're seeing is a general trend up in the searches for chatbots, which means people are using them more, they're more aware of them. So I think, again, this is a trend that's going to persist. And then we start to say, well, why? Well, you get quick answers. It's a 24-hour service, so I can use it when it's convenient for me rather than when it's convenient to somebody else. It's the 9 to 5 high street bank problem. That's great, except if you're working 9 to 5, it becomes very difficult. And so as you see things go mobile, as you see things move online and away from physical, there's then this trade-off as well between what you can do quickly. So call centres, again, not necessarily in line with what I need in terms of my day and my time. So the immediacy of this is very important. 24-hour service, convenience, quick answers to complex questions, ease of communication, detailed expert advice, can complain about something. If you look at all of these things, these are actually, for me, things that pensions does not do well. And if chatbots are potentially doing this well in other areas, and these areas could be quite complex, then I think, again, this could be something really powerful to help people save more and have a better retirement in the long term. So then that's the sort of upside, the sort of positive outlook for it. But how could mistakes happen? Well, we had the retail distribution review, and that was very much the right thing to do because of the opaque pricing that was going on in some of the conflicts of interest that were potentially present in the financial advice market. But what that's had is an effect where IFAs and high street banks are starting to focus more on people with money. 50,000 is probably not even enough now to really get people wanting your business. So you're probably well into having 6 figures of liquid assets outside of property before you're going to get somebody who really wants to advise you. And so what that means is as that value chain is going up and up and up, there's more and more competition for people with assets and money, and there's more and more people down the bottom who are not getting advice. And those people are arguably the people who need advice more. Because if you've got money, you're probably getting advice already, so it's just more people are competing for the business. And at the very top end, there's always going to be a bespoke service anyway. You don't want a chatbot if you're very well off. And so the solution that a lot of people talk about is Robo Advisory. And so with Robo Advisory, there's a problem because there's an assumption about what people do, how people behave. So I was involved in the retirement outcome review. We were looking at freedom and choice, and we were looking at the unadvised consumer journey. And there's just a couple of little statistics here that are quite important. Why did you access your money? Why did you take your pension before you could draw it down? Because I can put it in the bank. Because I can purchase a new car, or I can go on holiday. I can improve my property. Helping your family is a difficult one, paying down debt. But if you look at the top reasons that people cited, because I can take a tax-advantaged savings product, which is still invested for me, into a cash ISA. And this was done 3 years ago, I think now. So we're not talking about in a high interest rate environment. This is a real problem. So the way in which people behave is not rational or is not necessarily sensible. And I quite like this slide as well. So this statistics, I thought to have it as a slide. How long did you how long did you spend researching your choices? A few days, quite a lot of time, very little time at all. Not much time, a few hours, 17 people out of 54, quite a bit of time over a day. The vast majority of people spent less than a week thinking about this. The average person in the UK spends 2 weeks thinking about buying a second-hand car, comparing various models and so on. So when you think about the importance of that decision, you're going to take some pension money out, you're going to do something with it, the long-term implications of that. People spend more time thinking about buying a second-hand car than they do thinking about something like this. So advice is clearly going to be hugely important. So my final thoughts. The pensions industry is very, very slow to respond to change. So there's huge innovation going on across financial services, and I don't see a significant amount of innovation in pensions just now. And that's maybe a good thing, because it means that the pensions industry is not rash and it doesn't jump into unknown areas quickly because of the responsibility that it has. But also, I don't see much in the way of thinking about these things just now. This might be, I've done a lot of work on trustees, and actually might as well do a plug just now, Michael. I'm going to do another presentation which is called All Too Human, and it's about behavioural biases in trustee decision making sometime in May. And so when you look at the demographics of trustees, they are on average about 55, male, they've probably got DB, they're probably quite well off, and largely they are white as well, okay, and they're men. So there's a demographic skew potentially, which means that openness to innovation is possibly something that's harder to break through. Might not be the case, but it's one possible scenario. The other thing that I do think is telling, and the pensions dashboard shows this, is legacy infrastructure. This is a real issue. Financial services in many places is very innovative, but when we look at the systems that underpin things like asset management, when we look at the systems that underpin things like pensions administration, these are systemically important in lots of ways, but the systems are pretty clunky and they've been ad hoc evolved and kept going. So we don't have a whole new system that everything can just drop into to then get all this innovation. So getting around the infrastructure problem is going to be difficult. The next thing is data. And actually, we don't have good data. So we go right back to the start. How do we make the progress on AI, the ubiquity of data? We have open banking, but we don't have open pensions, and we don't have open advice. So if we want to see innovation in this sector, potentially open pensions and open banking is something that's going to have to happen at some point to allow a better product and service that's going to benefit the consumer to be produced. It's not without its risks, it's not without its challenges, but just now, innovation will not happen if we don't get better data. So for me, the scale of the challenge is huge, but I think the opportunity is absolutely immense. And I think that the impact that it could have, if it's done properly, will be to the benefit of the individual consumer, and it will also be to the benefit of society, because if people are better off in retirement, that has a massive bearing on the state, it has a massive bearing on the taxpayer, and it also has a massive bearing on consumption in general. So better pensions and more effective pensions and better retirements, I think, are something that everybody wants personally, and the cumulative benefit of that to society is quite considerable. But it does need to be done carefully. We have to understand the risks. We have to understand things like data ethics and privacy to a really high degree. We can't just run blindly into this, because there are some significant challenges. And also we have to think really carefully about the assumptions that we're making about people. People and their data is going to give us one impression of them. We have to make sure that when we build things based on the data, that it's going to actually achieve the goals that we want. And that's also a significant thing to overcome, but I do believe it's something that we can do. And I think that's me, Michael.
Well, my gosh, you've got the best inbuilt clock of any presenter I've ever seen. Absolutely spot on there. That is pretty impressive, Iain. Iain, we've got quite a few questions here, and I'm going to kind of try and deal with some of them. Probably just to kick off, did you indicate that the average pension is 50K, or did I mishear that?
No, sorry, that's saying that the average IFA is not going to speak to you unless you've got 50K.
Less than 50K. That's kind of what I thought. We had a kind of a misunderstanding here. Probably the first one was, do you think, if you had to choose, do you think the problems are outdated technology, or is it really much more financial literacy?
So I don't think you can make people financially literate in the way which you would expect them to be to deal with pensions. So I think you can help people with repeated financial decisions. So people get a good handle on things like credit cards and bank accounts and so on, because you interact with them so much. But if you think about what is required for pensions, you really need expertise. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect people to do it on their own. So financial literacy is something you can help people understand a little bit better, but you're not going to be able to make them go to a point of unsupported decisions that are going to be effective en masse.
Hmm. Another really good question here from Bob McDowell, actually. Much retirement investment is driven by tax, and finance ministers frequently tinker with modifications in periodic finance acts. I'd like your insights into how AI addresses these highly human actions.
I suppose the tax thing largely kicks in at the higher end, so it's quite a small number of people that are affected by it. So when you look at DB, part of the decline of DB has been accumulation of changes of policy from this, all well-intentioned, but the accumulation made it such a hard promise and potentially led to unintended consequences around things like holidays and the uptick in benefits and trying to give people certainty over something that was never a guaranteed promise. It was a best efforts endeavour. So I think in that regard, DB is one issue, but DB was always done for you, so you didn't have to be an expert. When you get to the world of DC, when we look at annual allowance and lifetime allowance, I think these are bad policies. And AI can't help you with that.
But even, I mean, even on training an AI system, if the tax basis is changing a lot, then you can't just sit there and say, well, I'm going to rely on historic data to drive the engine. You've got to find some way of introducing rules at short notice, don't you?
But again, this is going to be for a very small tranche of people. So if you're getting hit by the annual allowance, if you're getting hit by the lifetime allowance, then you're going to need tax advice, whereas what we're talking about is mass advice for people who are going to have what would be considered by most people in financial services and so on as being relatively small pots, but they're actually very important for those people.
There's quite a cheeky question here. Basically, you had those 54 people who spent less than a day deciding to whiz their pensions straight out into a bank. How irrational was that, actually, if they had retired then and in the current market downturn? Was that actually an irrational decision? Are you having an unfair go at them?
So what we're talking about is unadvised consumer journey. So for these people, they are in a position of having very small pots or relatively small pots. And so they're doing early encashment under freedom and choice. So they're doing it at the age of 55 and above before their natural retirement date. And it's things like the full implications of that aren't always well understood. So if you took 20,000 out of your pension, stuck it in a bank account, actually it could affect means tested benefits. So these things aren't without consequences. The downturn, if I knew there was a downturn coming, I would have behaved very differently with my investments. I'd have shorted quite a lot of stuff.
Wouldn't we all?
Yeah.
Now you touched or skipped straight across open pensions. I don't want to get into open banking, but somebody's asking here, what did you mean by open pensions? What are the implications of that?
If we think about all the data that is going to be aggregated in separate places, so if we just take places like Nest, they're going to have huge amounts of granular data on people. If you take the people's pension, huge amounts of granular data, USS, huge amounts of granular data. And none of this is put together, none of this is combined in a way where we could start to think about having a better picture of the evolution of people's benefits, how people save, various things that come along and affect them, and whether or not there's actually any value in the data itself. I think we're past the point where the data is not of value, but you can never guarantee that. And so just now, the data all sits in silos, and we can't really have a process by which people could innovate around that data. So if we had lots of different data sets, we had lots of different ways in which we could analyse and think about it, then potentially you could start to develop and train something that could be a bot. It's not easy. And the quality of the data, the lack of standardisation and so on, I think is one of the big challenges. But I do think if there was to be open pensions, then that could help with innovation, which I think is required.
Okay. An interesting question here from Leslie Tully asking, are there any insights into the gender split in terms of how women and men behave when it comes to starting a pension? And if I could tack on to that another question, which is, are you talking about effectively bots and trading systems providing very different advice to different genders and other categories of individual?
Well, you would expect an IFA would give you advice tailored to your circumstance, and you would expect a bot to do the same, or an AI system. I think when it comes to the gender issue in pensions, the challenge is always around risk aversion early on in females, and I think it's also about the sort of cycle of work where women drop out the labour force for a while generally to have families and things. So I think there's a shift in some of that. So that split is now not largely or not always falling solely on women, but it's still something that's there. But my idea about this is just we could get people to get tailored advice. Like all advice, you don't have to take it.
An interesting point here, which is actually I wrote an article on this a couple of years ago about why financial services firms might be terrified of providing a robo advice. And the reason for that is that the scale of documentation is something they've never dealt with before. You're going to have a pretty solid audit trail. You could stamp it on a smart ledger or blockchain, whatever, but you're going to have the ability to kind of go back to your pension advisor and say, hey, 25 years ago, you gave me this advice, and here's the chain of what happened. Any thoughts on that?
So when we did the CDC blockchain, one of the things that I thought was very appealing about it is we could hold trustees to account for all their decisions.
You might just want to back up and explain what that was, the CDC blockchain.
The piece of work that I did with Con Keating and David McKee for Michael looked at collective defined contributions and how you could build a CDC pension system and have it on a blockchain and the relative advantages of that. And one of the things that I really liked about it was the accountability for decision making. So actually we could trace back to bad decisions. And I don't think that's unreasonable, where we have some higher level of accountability. But I think that's something which would make a lot of people uncomfortable, and I can understand why. So for example, if we just take the recent events of the past 3 months, you can't really be expected to be held accountable for advice you gave in November. Mm-hmm. Because there are things that happen outside the system. So I think there is something about exogenous shocks in the natural evolution of markets versus bad advice.
Drago Injik asks, IFAs represent a real barrier. Is there a hybrid solution? Or, if I've got all of these bots doing things, why would I need an IFA? Don't I just tell them to get out of the system?
So I do think IFAs will continue to have a role, but IFAs don't serve the vast majority of the population. So what we're really looking at here, or what I would like to think could happen, is the democratisation of financial advice. So lots and lots of people have £10,000, which nobody's going to give advice on. That £10,000 is considerably more important in an economic sense, in my opinion, than somebody that's sitting with £500,000 in the bank. Mm-hmm. Their ability to take a hit on that 10,000 is almost zero. It's genuinely life savings. If you have a bit of bad advice on 20,000 out of 500,000, you can sort of shrug it off. So I think IFAs are always going to have a role, but that role is going to largely be around a client-facing higher end of the market. And what I'm really interested in is everybody that is ignored in the current system.
Mm-hmm. What role? This is a question from Tom Fairburn. What role, if any, do robot trading systems have in the AI systems that you're talking about?
I've not really linked it up to sort of investment, if I'm being honest. So my thinking's about advice, but I will actually give that some thought, because what you're suggesting is the complete disintermediation of financial services. No, I'll have to give that some more thought.
Well, there's some interesting stuff I've certainly seen in China. When you're chatting with Alipay and Tencent and things, you begin to realize that they are not dedicated to our model of vertical silos where we've got asset managers, investment managers, and IFAs. They seem to be going almost straight from a cash account into an ETF almost, where you're you're sitting there on your mobile phone with your Alipay, and you just simply say, well, actually, I'd like to, I ran into somebody in a coffee shop who recommended to me that I invest in Southeast Asian healthcare. I'm going to take 5% of my money and put it there, and I'm done. And the IFA is out the window. The investment manager is largely out the window. And so Tom's bit here about robot trading could be a genuine disintermediation there.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Got time for one more question, I think, before we close. This is from Hugo Innes. Is there anything we can learn from US companies like Robinhood and Wealthfront over here in the UK?
I think there's always things that can be learned from companies all over. So you're talking about Alipay and things. If you look at Ant Financial and you look at various other models all over the world, I think there's always something that can be gleaned, something that can be looked at, something that can be learned. But I also think you then have to take that back and think about the context in which it's being applied. And so I don't think there's really ever a straight translation from those examples to the UK context for lots of different reasons. Some of it will be legal, some of it will be cultural. And so I do think there's lessons, but they also have to then be contextualised when you bring them back.
Well, Iain, I'm going to have to kind of call it quits here. You've been you get the Minelli Award for absolutely perfect timing and good and succinct question answering, which was phenomenal. I think we got through almost all of the questions here, and I'll go back and have a quick look, and we'll get back directly to anybody who asked a question that we didn't touch upon. Second thing is my sincere apologies. Of all the slides to double click on, I click on the one that most needed the reveal, so I'm very sorry there. I also think you did a great job at pointing out to people. We're going to have another session with Iain sometime in May. We're just trying to find a suitable date in the calendars of both FS Club and Leeds University. And in that session, as Iain indicated, he's going to be talking about the behavioral biases that we see amongst trustees. I've seen some of the material on this, and it is really, really interesting and compelling stuff. So I'm very much looking forward to it. And just a final reminder on the slide in front of you, we have a number of webinars coming up later today. In fact, at 2:30, we're going to be flipping over to Canada with a focus on Montreal. And tomorrow, a fascinating session where we're going to be looking with the ESOP Center at how to put enterprise management initiatives in, an equally important aspect alongside pensions. And further details of all of these are, as you'd expect, on the website. So it just simply falls to me to give a virtual round of applause from everybody to you, Iain. So it was absolutely an excellent presentation and much appreciated by everybody. So thank you very much.